Okay. Hi, and welcome to everyone. I am Sheldon Lachambre. I'm the Engineering Director for Zen Desktop Server Components based out of the UK. Today, I'm going to walk you through AppDisks. AppDisks is a new virtualization technology that Citrix has produced. It's in tech preview at the moment. Today, we'll also discuss why you would use AppDisks. We'll have a look at how it works, talk a little bit about the changing virtualization space, and then look at AppDNA and how AppDNA fits into this picture. Look at the complete integration that Studio brings you, and then we'll end with a demo. The demo is not a live demo. It is a video that I'll annotate as we go along. But if you're interested in seeing something a bit more live, you can come to our booth. So let's dive right in. I could have started this by giving you a big kind of business value prop. That will come a bit later. But let's just understand first what we're speaking about. What are AppDisks? In effect, it's a new application virtualization technology. You're probably thinking, well, you know, I've already got AppV or whatever application virtualization you're using. This is slightly different. It delivers applications in the form of layers, like a lot of other technologies, but without isolation. And because it's loaded exceptionally early on during the system load, it supports drivers, which a lot of virtualization technologies don't. So as a consequence, it supports almost all applications. Not every single application. There are a handful of applications that have drivers that will load before our driver. I think no one can support every single app under the sun, but the compatibility profile is exceptionally high. Because you don't have isolation between the different layers, all of the applications can see each other. And as a consequence, you don't have to deal with the complexity of dependency management. So knowing that this application requires Java runtime and that requires this plugin, it can be a nightmare, especially in complex environments where you're discovering those dependencies much later or needing to update those dependencies. The great thing is the application looks, feels, and smells like a completely fully installed local application. It looks that way to the end user. It looks that way to Windows. The layer itself is completely read-only. So it can't be infected or changed or modified. You can put a writable layer on top of it for personalization or any additional kind of settings that you'd like to push down. You can keep that layer in a pristine state throughout its lifetime. So why would you use AppDisks? And it really goes back to the original promise of VDI, which is move away from managing multiple images and desktops. And, you know, there have been a number of false starts in this area. And I'm not saying that other virtualization technologies or approaches are necessarily bad. They just can't complete the entire spectrum. So, you know, people thought that moving to AppV would solve all the problems. AppV is a great technology, by the way, and we're not saying don't use it. In fact, within Citrix, we encourage using it. You know, there are some apps that will work better with isolation, but it doesn't move you towards a completely neutral operating system image that you can just layer applications on and off of. AppDisks moves you a step closer. So you can create these layers. You can slide them in and out. You can change the operating system underneath the AppDisk, and it should still work. Now, nothing is perfect. There are going to be some issues that creep in when you start swapping the operating system out, but the AppDNA integration will keep you on the safe path and make sure that you're not doing anything that will cause any of the applications higher up in the stack to break. And also, because there's no isolation, you do need to be a little bit more careful around kind of conflict management when you deploy these layers. So you get fast and reliable application delivery, fewer images that you need to manage. It should reduce cost because the layer is shared between multiple end users, so you don't need to duplicate it for every single department. And obviously you have the built-in assessment guidance that AppDNA provides. So how does this magic work? It's quite simple. You start off within the admin console, Citrix Studio, for example, and you create layers. Pick an operating system, a machine catalog, and you can start creating a layer for the different departments. Maybe you want to group apps by how frequently they use. So let's put Office. Everyone gets the Office AppDisk in this organization. But then we have a software engineering team, and we'd like to put Visual Studio and WinMerge in that layer. And then you may have some laptop-specific or desktop-specific pieces of software that you need to deploy. It could be certain types of device drivers or specific applications for those builds. And you can put those into layers and then dynamically construct the layers depending on the end user. So it could be engineering, it could be sales, it could be finance. So are we saying that isolation is passé? It's, yesterday's technology. Well, no, we're not. As I said, isolation is a very important aspect when you're tackling application virtualization. And as virtualization moves forward, so too does the complexity of dealing with all these new ways to virtualize apps, virtualize operating systems. And in effect, you've got two types of virtualization technologies, the way I see it. You've got isolation technologies, things such as AppV. There are other players in that market. And containers. So you've got containers coming down the line, which have very strong and varying degrees of isolation. If you have a Hyper-V container versus a Windows Server container, they work slightly differently. And when you're dealing with these types of virtualization technologies, you are dealing with dependency management. You need to understand what needs to go into that virtual bubble in order for that application to work. And as you roll forward in time, you're going to need to understand exactly what's in each of those bubbles, because if you need to update the .NET runtime or deploy a security patch, you need to know which of the bubbles contain which versions of which runtimes, etc. Now, the isolation is useful. There are very many applications that were designed to run on a single machine for a single user, and by isolating them, you break that dependency. So they're great, but they have a lower application compatibility threshold. And that may not be true for a container where you're deploying the app within an OS, but what I mean by that is applications needing to speak to other applications create compatibility issues. And if you take something like AppV, which loads quite late at login time, for example, there are drivers and they're very application-specific things that happen very early on in Windows startup that those technologies can't deal with. In contrast, you have AppDisks, and there are others in the market that are doing similar things in a slightly different way, where consider it maybe the next generation of application virtualization, where people have realized that that dependency management problem is a lot bigger than we thought it was. So we went from conflict management with Windows Installer to dependency management with AppV. So the move now is back towards no isolation. It's a lot simpler to just understand that you can deploy applications in layers to end users, and the applications will work together. However, you do reintroduce the conflict management problem. That said, modern applications should be okay. There has been a massive shift in software engineering over the last decade. So .NET apps and modern C++ apps use side-by-side assemblies which help isolate things even on a shared system. But unfortunately, there are very few people who are managing just modern applications. There are a mix of legacy applications that do not behave well and do not play well. So And we'll talk about how to deal with that a bit later. One of the other things to consider is that the application in isolation brings a lot of complexity. But over time, there are other aspects that just drive the complexity within managing applications in an organization up. There's change management. I need this app this month, and I don't want to use that app anymore. How do you deal with that? Environment management. That could be as simple as pushing out new GPOs or security settings across the organization. And sprawl management, which is really the fact that as technology matures, it splinters, and organizations become more and more complex by having different technologies, different operating system stacks within the organization. And that sprawl is really difficult to deal with. So, is AppDisks a panacea? Most certainly not. We're not saying that it's going to solve absolutely every problem. The key thing to understand is that it doesn't matter which virtualization technology you use. All of them are going to have limitations, and if you understand those limitations and understand how to use the technologies, you can get the best out of them. As I said, certain applications, for example, need isolation. Some applications, if you isolate them, will break because they expect to see things. Some have drivers which don't play well when virtualized. They could have operating system compatibility conflicts. Some have specific dependencies, and this is very prevalent. You have multiple builds. You move an application from build A to build B. Suddenly it breaks because the Visual C12 runtimes are not on the machine. Inter-application conflicts are another area where you start, and if you come from a kind of Windows installer background, this may take you back a decade where you were dealing with DLL hell scenarios. It does still happen where applications overwrite each other's settings or files or registry keys. So let's look a bit deeper. When you're creating these layers, irrespective of the technology you use, one of the issues can be created by a layer order conflict. In other words, the order in which you put those layers will generally determine which DLL or file or registry key is seen by the operating system. So you can get into a horrible mess where if you get the layers in the wrong order, you end up seeing the incorrect DLL, and that can break applications. So it is something to be aware of. Now, obviously, the AppDNA solution understands this and can tell you the correct order of layers, or in the Citrix Studio example, it will actually automatically order the layers for you, so you don't need to worry about this issue. So the next one is missing dependencies, and I touched on this earlier. So when you're capturing a layer and MSI and AppV package, it doesn't really matter. If you have a machine that is not 100% clean, you could end up capturing, let's say, a Java app, but you got the Java runtime on the machine from a previous run or as part of the corporate build or however it got there. And then you take this AppDisk or AppV package or whatever it is and deploy it somewhere else, and the host OS hasn't got the runtime, obviously the app's going to break. So once again, the AppDNA analysis will tell you whether all of the AppDisk layers that you're trying to attach to a machine are complete or whether they're missing some dependencies. And then finally, I mean, this is very obvious. This, AppDNA, for those of you who don't know, is the industry standard for app compat, over almost a decade old. And this is what we've been doing, whether it's an XP 32-bit to Windows 10 64-bit migration, or a much smaller hop, Windows 7 64-bit to Windows 10, AppDNA knows whether applications will work, not through having a database of applications, but by actually extracting the low-level binaries and looking how those applications will behave at runtime. And we do that by looking at API calls and so forth. So once again, if you attempt to attach an AppDisk that was created onto a machine that hasn't got some of the compatibility the AppDisk requires, and I've taken very obvious stuff here, like Gina was removed in Windows Vista, and 16-bit isn't going to work on any 64-bit platform. So if you're attaching to XenApp with Server 2012, you're going to run into app compat issues. But once again, you will be warned. So I've already alluded to this. This is where AppDNA enters the picture. It's an application assessment platform. Our focus has always been compatibility, but it's really important to understand that it's not just compatibility. You can assess your apps for internal compliance standards, security if you wanted to. Recently at Synergy, I did a presentation that showed how you could detect all of the applications in your enterprise or your organization that used or redistributed OpenSSL, so that if you were doing something about the heartbeat security vulnerability, you could pull those apps and make sure they had the latest version. We have built some automated sequencing and automated documentation into the product as well. This wraps around the Microsoft AppV command line sequencer, but while you're going through it, it will also automatically take screenshots and generate a document. That's more of a help for people who are doing a migration from MSI to AppV and at the same time looking at XenApp and new operating systems. And one of the key things is we're not just MSI. It does not matter what format your applications are in. In fact, probably about 7 years ago, I did an AppDNA plugin for Marimba. It could be an in-house system. As long as you can trigger the installation of the app, AppDNA can do an install capture, which is a basic kind of MSI snapshotting process. Before snapshot, install the app, post snapshot. We don't produce an MSI that you can go and install. It's purely for the AppDNA reporting purposes. But if you did want a package-ready MSI, there are repackages out there, Flexera and other such partners have that you can plug into our execution profiles. So what's the key business value really in the AppDNA approach? It's effectively a way of automating some of the assessment of applications. Traditionally, in environments, people will get an application, they'll do a manual install of it, they'll then do, they might push it to UAT, but they'll probably do a bit of a smoke test. If it fails, there's an investigate and remediate phase. Once that succeeds, it could go back to the packaging team. This cycle can move through different teams, both in-house, outsourced, and every time it moves, it wastes time and it wastes money. So, and one of the key things to remember here is if you're lucky enough to be doing something very simple like a Windows 7 64-bit to a Windows 10 migration or business as usual work for a customer, it's probably manageable depending on the size of the portfolio. But very often when people do these big forklift projects, they start throwing other things in. We want to move to 64-bit, we want some AppV, we'd like to look at XenApp as well, and that just starts multiplying the number of platforms and the number of tests that you need to do, and it soon becomes pretty much unmanageable in a manual way. The AppDNA way, very simple, take an application, import it into the AppDNA platform, and it will give you a compatibility profile for Windows desktop, operating systems, 32-bit, 64-bit, server, XenApp. Interoperability is the traditional Windows installer conflict checking. If you have to install the app natively, it will look at the key paths and so forth. AppV. Is this app going to be easy to sequence? Will it work when it's deployed with AppV or not? AppDisks, and finally vNext. Whatever comes next, we're staying ahead of the curve. The great thing is you can then take the recommendations and the details from within AppDNA and you can decide what you want to do. You can tier your applications, and you'll probably say tier 0 business critical apps. You know what, those are going to be fully tested. We're not taking any chances there. But tier 2 and tier 3 apps, rarely used or only used by a handful of users, we may go straight to deploy rather than going through an expensive testing and remediation phase. This strategy depends on how risk averse you are and how sure you want to be. So, as I said, the key thing with AppDNA, AppCompat, everyone always talks about AppCompat. We've been doing it for near on a decade, but there's much more to AppDNA. The whole point is to get your applications in there so that you can ask other questions of your portfolio. As time marches on, the demands placed on IT professionals are going to increase. Security, organizational consistency, standards will become more and more important. So there are things such as the Zen App and Zen Desktop migration and adoption solutions. So whether you're coming from a physical to virtual environment or doing a virtual to virtual migration, this can help you. Application interoperability I discussed. Forward path is quite an advanced feature. It does require a bit of technical skill, but it will allow you to decide or create decision buckets around applications. So you can say, if the application is green for AppV and green for AppDisks, then I want to use AppV. There's also integration with SCCM and Active Directory. So, you know, the traditional way of showing application reports within AppDNA is by application. But if you would like to, you can pivot the data and see it by organizational unit. So you could see, finance have a bit of a problem. We can see some of their applications have gone red. Why is that? As I mentioned, the automated AppV sequencing, we haven't written our own sequencer. It's Microsoft's AppV sequencer, so it's fully supported by them. What we've done is build an automation platform around it so that you always have a clean machine, so that you can sequence in an automated format. You can line up, let's say, 500 applications, hit go, and it will just blindly sequence through them. We are looking to enhance that in the future to check the health of the sequence afterwards and improve it if we can. Application attribute tagging, very technical way of putting it, but what it allows you to do is integrate your data into AppDNA. So if you wanted, for example, to track the license cost or the business unit owner of the application, you can create attributes to store that data within AppDNA. And finally, we have a full SDK. So if you're a third-party software provider and you're looking to get some of the AppDNA data and you'd like to show it in your console, the SDK, you can use that to import, analyze, extract data out of AppDNA. So, as I've said, it's not just for compatibility, not just for Christmas, it's for life. There's security analysis that you could do. We have some templates where you can roll your own custom algorithms within the product. You could do standards compliance, you can do cost projections, modeling, and obviously compatibility, which is one of our pillars. So I've spoken about two separate things here. I've spoken about AppDisks, I've spoken about AppDNA, and I spoke a bit about how the virtualization world is changing and how complexity is ever increasing. So how does it all come together? Well, it comes together in Citrix Studio. For those of you not familiar with Citrix Studio, it's really the admin console where IT administrators will go to publish applications or desktops to end users. And through very simple integration, at AppDNA, when you create an AppDisk, you don't ever see the AppDNA console unless you want to. We'll just tell you whether the AppDisk is good, or if there are any issues, you can then click on it to view the issues. And when you assign it to delivery groups, which is effectively attaching it to different machines, it will once again dynamically assess those and let you know if it's detected any issues. So let's see it live, well, in a live video. So I'll walk you through the process. The first part is creating the AppDisk. You'd come into Studio. It's very simple. There's an AppDisk node. You hit Create, select a disk size. This is where you pick your machine catalog. Machine catalog's just a backing machine, so this would normally be your corporate VM. Name the AppDisk. And at this stage, whether it's MCS or PVS, we'll go and provision the machine, attach the AppDisk for you. You don't even know it's really happening. You would then remote into the machine and then run the installation. And we've picked iTunes because it's a complex app with drivers that load very early on. Install it as you normally would. You can tell it's not live. And once you're done, you would hit the Seal AppDisk. So actually, you can put multiple applications on the same AppDisk. You're not restricted to one per AppDisk. And when you've done that, AppDNA will, the provisioning system will seal it, pass all its data up to AppDNA for an automated analysis. So should there be an issue with one of the disks, you'll be able to access a report which will show you the compatibility. So we'll see that at the end. At this point, this is attaching the AppDisk to a given machine. So you saw there was no iTunes. Attach it. Okay, so this is the one thing to be aware of. Attaching an AppDisk does require reboot for the time being. So everything's okay. If there were any issues, you would get a report. So this is a standard AppDNA report, no issues to see here. And now you can see with the disk attached, iTunes appears. It looks like a completely locally installed application. And you can do this both with seamless applications, so delivering just an app to an end user or delivering an entire desktop. So that was the kind of positive use case. But what about a bad app disk? So here we've taken a very early version of iPass, which used to use Gino, which won't work on any modern operating system. And you can see that AppDNA warns you up front that there's an issue with this. So same thing. So this is during attaching. It will also double check the disk. Okay, so we can show you a live setup with apps if you come to our booth a bit later. This was just a very quick video to show you the overview of the creation process and then how you would assign that to end users. Yeah.
So I have two questions. First is, for the creation of these AppDisks, do you need a Zen server backend or will it just work with VMware or whatever?
Yeah, so at the moment we support in the tech preview ESX and Zen server, so VMware and Citrix. Yeah.
The other thing is, as I understand it, the applications are deployed on boot, basically.
The disk is attached at boot, yes.
Right. What happens if you're in a bandwidth-constrained environment, for example, and you deploy a large application which is several gigabytes large?
Yeah, so it's...
Which is a common case, obviously.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's not streaming it down to the machine. It depends on where the hypervisor is because it's doing a hypervisor level attach. So if that disk is already in the same storage zone, there should be no cost. Okay, so in conclusion, no virtualization is perfect, but when you combine AppDisk, AppV, XenApp, you get the best of both worlds. Automated and integrated analysis is the future. I really believe that as the world changes, being able to assess your portfolio of apps across different technologies is going to become more and more important. It must be easy, quick to deliver to end users, moving towards single image management. Managing dependencies shouldn't be a hassle. Exceptionally high compatibility, as we've seen, and best of all, it's at the tech preview state now, so you can go to citrix.com, you can download it, come to the booth, we'll scan your badge and send you an email on how you can get hold of the AppDisks tech preview. So just as a kind of parting thought, you know, in case you don't know about Citrix, Citrix is a virtualization company that gives you the broadest way of delivering applications, whether it's via XenApp or XenDesktop or using AppV or AppDisks, SCCM, you name it. So that's it. Come see us at the booth. Do you have any questions? Yep.
Maybe a stupid question. Does it only work in virtual environments, so VDI or?
Yes. So in this version, it only works with hypervisors. So it is virtual only, but we are looking in the future how we can support physical attach, and they would probably be done initially via PVS. This, by the way, is supported with both MCS and PVS, but it does a disk attach, not a stream.
No.
Yeah. Any other questions? Nope. So there's absolutely no drive letters. It's completely seamless and hidden to the end user. If you go scratching around in the logical disk manager, you will see some additional disks, but they don't consume any drive letters. Any other questions? Okay, if you have any questions a bit later on or are more curious, please do pop by our booth. Great, thank you all.